Hi, I'm Dan Schmidt. I was at Looking Glass, well, before it was called Looking Glass, back in from 91 to 96, and since then I've been at Harmonix Music Systems.
And one of the themes of this podcast is I've been calling it looking for authorship. So going through the games, talking to different people who may not have been identified as the sole author of the game, but part of the idea is that there isn't a sole author of the game, to try to explode that notion and just talk about maybe interesting moments you remember, interesting problems, and who was responsible for them, stuff you specifically remember doing or that you remember other people doing. I know, for example, you mentioned something on your blog recently where you were talking about bugs in Underworld 1, and you mentioned the Pac-Man moment, and I don't remember who you said that was the brainchild of a particular person, or
It was a programmer. His name is John Mayara.
Okay.
Shall I talk about just sort of the Underworld design?
I think we can.
Where that came from?
I think we can. Yeah, that's definitely probably the first place we want to go. I was wondering if we could maybe start with a little bit more background about maybe your memory of how you got into the company. I know you were a student at MIT,
right?
And just kind of how that all came about and how you get in.
Yeah, that's really where it all started. I was at MIT in the late 1980s, early 1990s, which makes me an elder statesman by now. And there were these computer clusters, and which were supposedly for doing homework and things like that. But of course, lots of people use them to play games. These were mostly text games like NetHack and Moria and stuff like that. And you could see, of course, who was playing games because you could look over everybody's shoulders and see all the monitors. So there was this sort of informal community that developed of people who played games late at night in the computer clusters. And some of those people were programmers, computer science students like myself. One of them was Doug Church, who ended up being a big computer game guy. Another one was a guy named Terry Donahue, who is now a priest. And he was super smart guy.
He's a priest?
He is now a priest.
Oh, wow.
Smarter than either me or Doug. And he was writing a game by himself called X-Tank, where it was like a top-down vector graphic style tank game where you could go around and do combat. And one of the neat things about it was that you could program the tanks yourself. So you could write C code to run AI for a tank, and you could run AI battles against tanks. And Doug and I were working on some of that with him. He would give us stuff to do, why don't you design and code this subsystem, and we would do it. There was one mode of X-Tank which actually ended up becoming more popular than the tank battle thing, which was a sort of an ultimate frisbee simulator. You would have your tank would have a disc circling around it, and you could grab it and you can release it and go flying off at a tangent. You try to get into a goal, and I wrote an AI for an X-Tank ultimate playing robot, which ended up being this awesome AI. It could completely destroy people because it would calculate exactly what it had to do and thread the needle between various obstacles. It was awesome. So anyway, I'm getting to a point here. And I had also taken an AI class at MIT as just part of the curriculum. Anyway, so Doug was a year ahead of me, and he left, and then he briefly, I think, had 1 year doing military sim work or something, and then a friend of a friend was starting up this game company. At the time it was called Blue Sky Productions, and Doug got an in there, and so he became one of the programmers there. This is when there were 5 people there, and they were starting on this game called Underworld. It wasn't Ultima Underworld yet.
So the license came later.
The license came later, yeah. Although I think it was there by the time I joined. So then a year later, I graduated, and Doug told me, hey, we need an AI programmer, and you took an AI class, and you wrote this ultimate Frisbee tank AI. Why don't you come be our AI programmer? I said, sure, that sounds great. I mean, I had been, an Ultima fanboy since I was a kid too. So this was amazing.
So that was part of the draw for you, was the Ultima.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Yeah. I was actually really interested in the just a little bit about. So when I'm interested at the state it was in when you came on board. Like so it was originally started out as something that wasn't an Ultima thing. It was just like a dungeon thing, and then it became like an Ultima thing, and then, like what?
Right. I think it might have, the plan might have been all along to try to make it an Ultima thing. The CEO of the company, Paul Nurath, had done a game called Space Rogue for Origin, so he knew people at Origin who, of course, were doing the Ultima games. Although they had never, I think, let a third party do an Ultima game. It had all been in-house stuff, run by Richard Garry at Ward British.
Even though they had some spin-offs like Martian Dreams and stuff, but they were still in-house.
I think they were still in-house, and that was right before. That was right around the time. Those came out right around the time that I started working there. So I think his plan all along was to try to get Origin to put it in the Ultima series somehow. But if that didn't work out, we probably would have found some other license or some other publisher and started some other thing. So at the time that I joined, it was already in Ultima. There wasn't a plot or anything. It was basically a 3D dungeon simulator, and we were basically trying to put in features first and try to figure out what worked and what didn't in terms of an environment and what kind of things you could do, and even what kind of things a player could do and what kind of things we as programmers could do technologically, and then sort of put a plot and things like that on later.
I'm interested in that actually as a kind of a design process, because my take on a lot of the later Looking Glass work is that there's obviously a premium put on like trying to make something a coherent world and with a lot of kind of simulation aspects to it. And I've heard Underworld called like a dungeon simulator almost before being a dungeon game. And I'm wondering,
it was chronologically a dungeon simulator before it was a dungeon game.
Well, exactly. And that's an interesting design process, because I feel like some people would advise against that and say like you should really think about the game, and then, but you were kind of thinking about it as a simulation first. And how did that work for you?
Yeah, I might advise against it too. I think later on, if we get to Terra Nova, like I think that it didn't work so well in that case. We
should talk about Terra Nova, actually.
We'll get there, whether I want to or not. In a lot of ways, it was very powerful because it gave us the freedom to make the game and the environment like as good as it could be, and like sort of optimize that according to how well all of that stuff worked, instead of worrying about how we could implement certain things that we had decided had to be in here. On the other hand, it meant that actually coming up with the plot and the feel of the game at the end was a little bit ad hoc. I mean, and if you look at the plot of Underworld at the end, it's not actually particularly coherent, right? It's like this random, set of quests that's kind of shoehorned into the Ultima.
I don't even remember. There's like a princess or something on like the bottom of the dungeon, and then
right.
Like...
You arrive in Britannia, and the princess has been abducted, and they think you did it because you just showed up, and they throw you.
And there's this guy Baron Ulmerich, and he has Richard Garriott's voice.
He does
strangely. Yes. I remember thinking he was Lord British, but he's not.
Right. No, Richard wanted a cameo, so he got that. And then it's this kind of standard Ultima Quest thing of, do find things corresponding to the 8 virtues and stuff like that. But
I remember looking for the flute forever, because I think you have to like do that's with a cup, I think.
Yeah, I think you play the flute in the right place, and you have to play the right melody or something.
I had no friends helping me play that game, and I remember like figuring out everything by myself, and that was really hard.
So you were asking about authorship. I mean, not only did the authorship of the game sort of as a game come after all the simulation stuff, it also didn't really have a single author. Paul had hired someone like a contractor who is like an actual writer, I was making air quotes there, to to come up with the plot and the dialogue and all of that stuff. And that just did not really work out. He was too far removed from what we were doing, and it just didn't. There was a mismatch there. So we ended up all basically designing the game and writing all the dialogue ourselves.
So when you say yourselves, was it mostly programmers?
Programmers
artists?
and artists.
Really, everybody?
Yeah.
So how...
Each person got a level.
Oh, okay. So
basically.
So you would have an artist, and would you be doing art and programming work on all the levels, but then in terms of writing, each person, regardless of their other role, was given a level? Is that how it worked, or...?
The programmers were doing programming, the artists were doing art, but in terms of creating the level, creating like the geometry of the level, coming up with the dialogue, coming up with sort of the stories, the plots of that level. Like, oh, this person, lost their favorite, toaster, and you have to go find it over on this other floor and stuff. So each person basically wrote their own level, and so the levels all, like, a lot of them look pretty different and have different sorts of plots. I was sort of the person who then tried to take all of that and put it into a coherent, semi-coherent whole that made some sort of sense. So I edited all of the dialogue, and I added some references between stuff. We didn't have any designers per se. It was all just programmers and artists.
So it's actually really so you're an interesting person to talk to then for trying to create a coherent story out of it. At least that's what you were trying to do by kind of wrangling a lot of the other content.
Right. It kind of went both ways, right? We said, okay, we'll need these 8 quests. Okay, we'll put this quest on level 5. You get this quest on level 7, and then after everybody had done their parts, I kind of tried to knit it back together.
Did you? I mean, do you remember thinking it worked, or were you happy with it, or because as a player I was? I'm just wondering how it was to.
That's great. I think that it was a weird group also because most of us were right out of school, and this was the first commercial program we had done. So I think we all kind of felt unprofessional in some weird way. So I've written this, therefore it can't possibly be as good as the stuff that professional game designers in the past have made. So it all felt, I think, to us fairly kind of patched together and random, but it still, I think, ended up. We were pretty happy with where it ended up. I think it's not really the most coherent game, but probably people had a lot more tolerance for that back in 1992 or whatever than they would now.
In terms of an overarching story, when you say coherent?
In terms of our overarching story, in terms of when you went into a level, what that level would be like. I remember there was some lower level with tons of lava chasms and stuff, and it was it kind of felt like a different game, kind of from stuff above. That's probably the kind of thing that because we were so close to it, we would see that and say, well, this feels really weird, and probably someone who just picks up the game and starts playing it is whoa, now I'm in a level with lots of lava chasms. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's definitely how it was. Oh, I remember thinking it was because you were down farther. You were
sure,
it's at the bottom of the
right. I mean, it was done intentionally. It's just it felt that level to level things were kind of different. And for example, we said earlier there is this Pac-Man level. What's that there for? So it's all. It did not really make the most sense when taken as a whole, but somehow it worked out okay.
Well, I mean, it's also a game about exploring an unknown place, so there's kind of an eclectic feeling to the whole experience. It's oh, what's this level going to be, and what's this level going to be, and they're all very different.
Right, and we kind of took that to an extreme later in Underworld too, when we explicitly had different worlds, different dimensions, and didn't try to pretend they were all in one spatial place.
Oh, that's interesting. Are you saying that maybe the decision to make Underworld 2 about explicitly different dimensions came from the variety that was in the first game, and wanting to make that make more sense? Or
I didn't work so much on the design of Underworld 2, but I think that was there was definitely a design. We knew that we could do lots of things with different kinds of environments, and it seemed like a good idea to make that sort of make some sort of narrative sense.
Yeah.
in some way.
Okay. There was something. So there was just a few questions I had. So there's this crazy thing in Underworld 1, which is like there's these lizard people that have their own language that you have to learn, and I'm wondering if you have any memories of that, or like because you actually have to write it down. There's like nothing in the game that's actually helping you remember what their language is.
So here's another thing where we were not very like professional game designers. Is like there was information that people would like give you once, and then if you ask them about it again, they'd say like, "I already told you that."
Yeah,
like, it's not very good game design, but it was more realistic, right? We were trying to make everything realistic because it was this simulator. Yeah, the lizard man stuff that was all done by a programmer named JD, who used to be like a tech guy at Infocom before Blue Sky, and that was just like the kind of design that we were doing back then. We're like, hey, it's a puzzle, and we're not going to spoon feed it to you. It's very hard with puzzles in general, and I've found this also in like stuff I've done on the side writing interactive fiction. It's very hard to tell how difficult a puzzle is, and one problem that I often have is that I think in order to make a puzzle interesting, I have to make it fairly difficult, and then it turns out that it's actually way more difficult than I thought. And in fact, people really enjoy puzzles of the form like, this door is locked and there's a key in the next room, go find it and pick it up and bring it back. And a lot of Ultima type puzzles, which we put in Underworld as well, were basically just like, quote, puzzles of the form, like, oh, I need a loaf of bread, so I'll go to the baker, and he can't make the bread because he doesn't have flour, so he tells me to go to the next village and get flour, and I get it and bring it back. There's no like, there's no puzzle to be solved. You're just like going around sort of doing busy work. And so we were trying to do things that were more interesting than that. For example, you have to learn the lizard man language on your own. And I think that some of that, put extra demands on the player that.
Did you ever get any feedback from anybody that they disliked that, or that was a barrier for some players? Or because I know that that's a while after you get into the game, so you're kind of acclimatized to like the vibe of the game by the time you actually encounter that. Well, was that a deal breaker for anybody?
I don't remember seeing too many complaints about that kind of thing. Back then, like all the feedback we got basically was like posts on Usenet. That's like how you found out. It's not like they were like message boards.
So, but were people mostly positive about it from what you remember?
People were. We released a demo first that was just like 1 or 2 levels, and I remember people just being completely blown away just by the tech, just by the fact that you were moving smoothly through a 3D world. So people basically just like couldn't believe that they were playing this at all, and I think they gave us a lot of slack because of that.
And it was before Wolfenstein.
It was. I think Wolfenstein was just before us.
Okay, but it was like a matter of months, right?
Yeah. And of course, that was a very different kind. That was this sort of fake 3D of you're moving through this very 2-dimensional world, really, and it's being rendered in this sort of fake 3D. I mean, I shouldn't say fake 3D, but for example, we were using a 3D engine that let you like look up and down, and Wolfenstein depended on like everything being at right angles and you like looking straight and
there were no
stuff
ceilings
like that.
Or floors in that world. They had like sprites or something to suggest it, but it wasn't.
Right, it wasn't. It was all. It was really smart. They had these constraints over what the world could be like, and then they rendered that really fast. I
was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, or if you remember like some of the stuff. Like, do you remember any features or things that maybe fit in with the simulation aspect of it that were cut eventually? Or because I remember, for example, reading somewhere once, I think it was like a Warren Spector Doug Church retrospective, where they were talking about whether or not you should take damage if you run really fast into a wall, and that it was eventually decided like no, even though that would be realistic. And I'm wondering if you remember that or stuff like it.
I don't remember anything off the top of my head that like we tried to put in and then like cut because it didn't work. I think we went more on the side of like, oh, this pretty much works, let's leave it in. There may have been some sort of like more physics-based puzzles that like we just couldn't get to be consistent enough because we had this full 3D physics system running as well, which was not the most robust thing in the world either. So there may have been some things like that, but it's hard for me to remember any specific features that we had to cut late.
Actually, this reminds me too about before the podcast we were talking a little bit about interface, and that Underworld had this kind of like this crazy like totally mouse driven interface, and that is like really outside modern standards of what a 3D interface would be. And I was wondering if you remember like how that came about, or
well, the 3D interface, the standard modern 3D interface didn't exist at that time, and so we were kind of making it up by the seat of our pants as we went along. And we, I think, decided we supported keyboard movement, but we thought that would be too like abstract and weird. We thought that people just wouldn't get that, having like their left hand on the keyboard and their right hand on the mouse.
So keyboard and mouse movement you thought was
strange. Just people having to like remember these arbitrary keys. Like, of course, now everyone does that, and it's the standard interface. So everything, I think we put in the keyboard like movement quote cheats like fairly late in the process. It was mostly this analog mouse movement where the closer we had these zones over your 3D view, and so if you put the mouse to the right, you would turn right, but to the left, you would turn left, and the farther you were from the center, the more you would do it. And we thought it was this nice analog method for controlling your movement. But
you could creep.
By putting the mouse like just above the center.
Bit,
but the main problem was that it just didn't interact with using the mouse to do any of the other things you want to do, like interact with objects or fire your weapons at enemies or whatever. So you'd have these, like if you were trying to like run away from someone and then turn around and then fire your bow at them and then run up to them and fight with your sword, it was just you were trying to use your mouse to do everything, and it was very awkward.
It was interesting though in the sense that I remember playing it. It was a 3D game that you were able to play with one hand, which was I just remember finding that interesting at the time.
It was probably easier to play with two, like if you actually used the keyboard to move. But we did design it as a game that you were playing just with your mouse.
Is that did that have a lot to do? Was that like a holdover, I guess, from kind of Ultima? Because Ultima had actually kind of Ultima 7, I remember, had like a similar mouse interface.
Yeah, Ultima 7, I guess, came out at around the same time that Ultima Underworld did, which was a little unfortunate for us in terms of just how much attention got paid to us. So, we may have seen like builds of that at around the same time, but yeah, I think we just felt that it should be like this, generally a mouse interface.
There was one more thing I wanted to ask about Underworld, which was I know that at the time the scrolling 3D movement was kind of like the, oh my god, I've never seen anything like this. And I guess I'm wondering, was that part of like the original pitch? Was it like, we have to do like this scrolling 3D thing and that's going to be what makes this game special? Or was that something that kind of came along later, and was it like a really difficult challenge or not so much?
That was totally there from day one. I mean, that was before I showed up. Basically, Paul, who had made Space Rogue, knew this other guy, Chris Green, who I think now works at Valve, who is this graphics whiz who had come up with this super optimized texture map, like real-time texture mapper, that they thought would enable us to render a game in real-time 3D like that. So that was the core of the game idea, like all along. Like, okay, now that we have this tech, we'll make a real-time first-person 3D dungeon game. That came before anything else.
It's kind of interesting. When we had Austin Grossman in here, he said something about the fact that the real-timeness of that 3D space was so new that, at least in his imagination and in some people's minds, it clashed with some of the more abstract conventions like the conversation. And I'm just wondering if you were one of the people that thought that, or if you didn't mind it so much, like the fact that you had this like scrolling 3D world and then it would suddenly cut to another screen.
It was weird. Yeah, I think we just kind of felt that was kind of how we had to. There was no other way to do it, right? For one thing, the monsters and people in the game, for example, were rendered as sprites.
Yeah.
And you could sort of imagine that you could sort of picture yourself basically like being in this world, moving around it and seeing these characters, and you could kind of imagine that you were actually there. It made some sense. But if we tried to then go to some conversation while
somebody was chasing you, or
something. And suddenly, and you know, now they're just all like frozen there.
Yeah.
Like it would make it. So we decided like that. We sort of, since we couldn't really like render that stuff, we kind of had to abstract it all out and say like, okay, now you're going into the like sort of text based mode of the conversation, and then like we'll take you like back out afterwards. The whole thing with dealing with the real time 3D-ness of it. Not just being in 3D, but just the very analogness of it. Like you're not just moving a quote square at a time, right? You're doing whatever. It was a real pain for us in a lot of ways. A lot of things that would have been really easy to do from a design standpoint became a pain when you're doing everything in terms of this analog world with physics. Like I remember I was working on the combat AI for monsters, and one of the main things that they were doing that we had to make them do when they're fighting you is make sure to stay far enough away from you so that they looked good. So they're constantly trying to stay, and it's like it's a weird distance. It turns out that like they're like trying to stand like 10 feet away from you or something, so that their sprite will fit on the screen. But like half of the combat logic is just devoted to them trying to look good on screen, you know, because they're very vain or something. Instead of just trying to deal the maximum damage to you they can.
Well, there's something kind of weird with the perspective too, because there's a very small window in that game, which I remember was widened in the
that's basically
game.
It was all the pixels that we could that we could draw and still have a decent frame rate. Back when decent frame rate meant 10 frames a second.
Who this actually just reminded me, thinking about the screen. Who did I remember in the first game there were these cute little dragons that shut their eyes when things start to go bad, like in your UI. Do you remember where that came from, or
that was like probably the main 2D artist, who is Doug Weick. I bet that that was like we just were saying, oh, we could do this thing, and he said, okay, here's the animation, and we coded it up.
Okay. Now, actually, there's something I forgot about. But did you do the music or part of the music, or
I co-wrote the music for Underworld 2.
For Underworld 2.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was something that you got into later in this. Well, why don't we do one of the things that I thought was interesting. One of the things I wanted to ask you about with 2 is you were talking about the difference between Underworld and those kind of like block step kind of things, like the dungeons in like Ultima 1 through 5,
right? Or even the outside world in those Ultimas,
because you're still moving in blocks,
right?
There was this weird kind of parody of that in Underworld 2 that I remember, where like you go inside somebody's dream and then like suddenly you're in like an Ultima 5 dungeon and everybody's like a stick man. And do you remember this?
I remember it. I didn't do much work on Underworld 2, but I remember that. Again, I think part of it was just like, hey, we have the technical ability to do this stuff. Okay. It would be fun to do that.
Was it the same? You might not remember also, but I just there was a Q*bert level in Underworld 2. There was like because Pac-Man was in the first game, so there was there was Q*bert.
There was also a reference to Underworld in Underworld 1 to there was this puzzle. I think it was even called like the bullfrog puzzle or something, where there were these levers you used to like raise and lower different parts of a room so you could get somewhere, and that was a reference to Bullfrog Games that was doing games like Populous and things like where you like a god and you could change the world. So that was another industry like in joke.
Wow.
So yeah, we were doing that all over the place. I think that especially in games like Ultima, I don't know. There was always there was this sense of playfulness that like it was okay to put in like random references like that, and it somehow didn't seem like it like didn't fit in the world or something.
And you're saying that maybe those inherited that a bit from the main Ultima franchise, because I remember in Ultima you could find stuff like Calvin and Hobbes books or something in Britannia, and like these other
there were always all sorts of like weird references
to the real world. So you said that you were kind of like you were a programmer and kind of like high level story wrangler in Underworld 1. And then it was music in Underworld 2? Was that the only thing in Underworld 2? Or?
Pretty much. I probably did some sort of tech support on Underworld 2. Like I probably was still maintaining the AI systems and stuff like that. But I was mostly, at that point, moving on to the game Terra Nova, which took many years to finish.
Terra Nova was started that early?
Terra Nova was started in 92, I think, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And came out early 96.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting.
But just to get back to Underworld 2 for a sec,
sure.
What happened was, I forget why we, Underworld 1, the music was done by the Fat Man and the people he worked with, who was like the big like game music guy.
I remember that. Didn't he also do stuff for the main Ultima series? I remember the Fat Man being in a lot of Origin game credits.
Yeah, he was like Mr. Game Music.
Yeah.
And I forget what the reason was, that whether it was scheduling or budgets or whatever, we decided not to go with them for Underworld 2. And I said, hey, I can write the music. I actually, my degree at the time from MIT was actually music composition.
Oh, really?
I was majoring in both music composition and computer science. I didn't finish my computer science thesis until like 3 years later.
Oh, really?
So I said, hey, I can write the music. And the guy, Seamus Blackley, who we had recently hired to do physics, he was had a physics doctorate, and he was like a jazz pianist, and so we said like, hey, we could just give us a week off from regular work, and we'll go and like hole up in Seamus's apartment, and we'll like write all the music for Underworld 2.
So that's really interesting to me. Have you can you talk a little bit about like the aesthetic choices you made, or like what, like did you want to make it consciously different? Were you trying to make it fit with the dimensional theme or whatever? I'm just curious if you could.
We definitely tried to make all of the musics per dimension sound different from each other. So like there is this sort of like weird extra dimensional world where we had this tried to make this like spooky music, and there was some sort of like medieval, I guess everything is a little medieval, but there was some like medieval keep that we tried to have a more medieval sound to, and there was like the ice world that I tried to make very kind of icy, like with like plucked strings and stuff like that. So there was a definite attempt made to do that, but then there was also the main theme of the game as a whole, which we then tried to sort of sneak into each world like in a different way. I don't know how much it came across, but often the theme would be rearranged in some way, or it would be, I remember there was the sewer waltz when you went down into the sewers below the castle.
Is that what you called it?
We called it the sewer waltz because we took the main theme and we made a waltz out of it, but it would generally come back.
And that's something I suppose I would have to go back and play it, but I remember the music being a little bit more maybe ambient in Underworld 1. I mean, there was the crazy fight music, which I remember was like getting kicked in the face in Underworld 1. It was like there was no sound, and then suddenly like 1,000 instruments go kind of go crazy.
Then you get it again 30 seconds later.
30 seconds later, yeah. But no, and two, I do remember that. I remember that you have like the main theme, and there's a lot of like subtle, very subtle repetition of familiar elements.
Yeah.
Which was not so much in the first game, at least not that I remember.
And of course, we were working at the time in MIDI with that you could play, I don't know, like 4 or 5 like voices at a time. Mm-hmm. So the arrangements had to be extremely sparse, which was a big challenge on us
So
as well.
it was music, just music for you, not sound design?
Right. I actually did the sound effects in Underworld 1.
Oh, okay.
Everything had to be done by someone,
Yeah.
and we only had programmers and artists. So I did the sound effects on Underworld 1, which I couldn't even really tell you what the tech was. We used this weird sound effect system that Origin provided us, and there was this graphical editor for changing parameters, and I that's all I can remember about. I remember trying to tweak this thing for hours, trying to get something to sound vaguely like a door opening or something splashing in the water.
So it was all like, so there was not a lot of recorded audio. It was a lot of simulated kind of sounds.
Yeah, it was all actually synthesized in Underworld 1 at least, except for, of course, the voiceovers in the intro.
Yeah.
I don't remember if we moved to like actual recorded like digital sound in Underworld 2. Certainly we had by System Shock.
Yeah, there definitely. It's kind of. I would have to go back and check, but I do have a vague memory that there may have been some more recorded sounds in 2, but I'm not entirely
That would make
sure.
sense.
For some reason, I'm thinking that Doors opening had a recorded sound, although I may be wrong. I may be thinking of like, I don't know, Ultima 8 or something.
Maybe my synthesized opening door sound was just that
good.
good.
It was so good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very convincing. So I'm actually really interested in, now that you've mentioned Terra Nova. Because from my perspective as a fan of, I kind of came to Looking Glass through Origin just as a fan, and I was like, what is this Underworld thing, right? And then I kind of really became a Looking Glass fan and got into all the games. But Terra Nova is actually one I didn't know about until a few years later, and I was like, what? They made this game too? And then I remember going back and playing it sort of a few years after it came out, and then going like, oh my god, this has like full motion video cutscenes and all this kind of stuff. And I was just wondering if this is like a story you could tell, or a story that you have something to say about, just like how that whole game came about, why it was so long in development, and et cetera, et cetera.
I'll try starting from the beginning, and you can interrupt me whenever.
Sure.
So it actually started, I think in 92, which was when Underworld 1 came out. So that was we were then doing 2 projects in parallel, Underworld 2 and Terra Nova. And we had hired a new programmer, and he had this vision. He was really passionate about doing this powered battle armor game where you had a squad and you were going around on some planet in your powered battle armor, fighting enemies, sort of like a Starship Troopers kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And his vision for it was that it was like, again, sort of like this super simulation-y realistic thing where we modeled everything extremely realistically, and the AIs, were acting also very, very realistically. It was almost more of a simulation than a game. And so I started working on that as the AI programmer. And then over time, like all these years kind of start blending into one another for me. But he left after a while, and the game was a little bit in limbo. And then I became the lead programmer, I think, just kind of because there was a void to fill, and I just kind of bubbled up to it.
This was your main project at that
This
time?
was my main project at that point, which is by now, 93 or something.
So like would have been the same time System Shock?
So Underworld 2 started and finished, and then System Shock started, and we were still working on this thing. And part of the problem was because we had no fixed end date for it, or I don't know, maybe we did.
It didn't seem like you did, or you don't.
Right.
Yeah.
Like we were kind of trying to go with the same philosophy of like, oh, we'll just develop all the systems and then like a game will sort of come out of it. But the goal kept sort of changing. And I think also once this programmer left, like there was no one left who was really psyched about making it this really good simulation.
Mm-hmm.
But we still kind of inherited that vision and never really thought to change it. So we were having, I think, trouble trying to stay to that vision while it was, first of all, very difficult. And if we had just like stepped back from it and said like, hey, can we target, where we're going? Maybe we'll find something better. You also get into this problem when you're making games that take a long time. There's this arms race with the rest of the world. So originally, I think it was mostly going to be, the game was going to be these missions. You go and do these missions on the planet, and then, and maybe in between there would be, quote, cutscenes that would just be like basically either like static graphics or
kind of like Wing Commander,
or kind of Wing Commander
yeah.
1 type stuff. And then as other games and other Origin games actually started doing more interesting cutscenes and started doing full motion video, it was this sort of decision came down from above for us, like, okay, we need full motion video or else no one's going to take our game seriously.
This would have been probably around like 95.
Yeah, 94, 95.
Wing Commander 3,
now.
I think, was like 95 maybe.
Okay.
Like 95.
That was probably the thing that made us say, like, okay, we absolutely have to do that. So now we have this game that's already late, and now half of our resources are being poured into doing the full motion video, which, if you look at it now, it's pretty cheesy. And in fact, if you looked at it then, it was pretty cheesy too. And that was a giant distraction as well. But basically, like a game like that at the time just sort of had to have these full motion video game cutscenes to be taken seriously.
How did the full motion video sit with your production process? So like, if you're a programmer, what does the decision to, now we have to have full motion video cutscenes, how did that affect you day to day? Because it's somebody else really shooting it, right? I mean,
right. Well, at this point, I had somehow graduated from AI programmer to lead programmer to project director. Okay. So I actually had to deal with stuff on a higher level than just the programming. Now it was a big distraction for me in that sense, and also like designers now had to make. They were trying to tie things in the missions back to the video scenes, because the video scenes often would be reacting to what happened in the mission or setting up what happened next. There were tons of script rewrites. It was just, so it didn't affect the programming itself all that much. It was more just like extra budget, extra time for the designers and me.
I know that from what I've talked to of other folks, like Underworld 1, 2, and System Shock, didn't really have, like you were saying with Underworld, like hired writers so much. It was just like the people in the company. Is that also the case with the full motion video of Terra Nova, or was it more like a farmed out kind of like Hollywood kind
we
of
had
thing?
Someone outside do that. I'm trying to remember. We had we had people give us like pitches or like maybe like a couple of pages scenes to see if we'd like them, and some guy had
they would write stuff for you and send it to you and ask you if this is okay.
I think it's like when we were trying to find a script writer.
Oh, I see.
So we said like, here's
Samples.
like a setup for a scene. Give us a sample of like how this scene might go. And I remember that one guy like had this totally crazy stuff with like aliens and like one guy was like a head in a vat, and like it was just like totally nuts. And I'm trying to remember, like I want to say that like we actually used him and then forced him to dial everything down because it was so too weird, and then it all became kind of generic.
Sounds like he was writing like a Doctor Who episode.
He probably was when he started. It was this total gonzo thing that like ended up everything got really like smoothed out. Anyway, then like at some point, basically Terra Nova had to ship, or like like the company was going to go under or something, or we were just going to cancel it. So right with a few months left, we actually completely changed the game entirely and made it much more arcadey and less simulation-y, so that now you were basically, instead of like all the simulation, you were just like going around like blowing people up, and it was very if you played it, people, that your enemies have sort of these brackets on them showing their health in like various directions, and it's very like bright and glowy and red and green. And, so all of that kind of stuff is sort of like what went in at the end, and it made it way more fun. And so the game actually, by the very end, like the game 6 months before it shipped was not fun at all. And we actually ended up shipping something that was at least somewhat enjoyable to play. I mean, I see people, I had kind of a negative experience overall just because the whole thing dragged on forever. But I know that there are people who regard it highly, so it can't have been that terrible.
I've played a few missions of it, and I remember thinking it was fun. What I am curious a little bit about when you say it was more simulation-y, can you give a few examples of what exactly that means? Because it's making me think of like something like Steel Battalion, which is like this, crazy game that like erases your save if you eject from your robot, So like what?
Well, one thing I remember, maybe this is a little off of like the game simulation, but the physics simulation for a while, one of the big features of Terra Nova was going to be our amazing physics simulation. Seamus, the physicist who co-wrote the Underworld 2 music for me and then went on to lead Flight Unlimited and then became like the head of the Microsoft Xbox team, had this physics code that he was working on to like simulate a biped, a person with 2 legs. That was going to be like the best simulation ever and be super realistic. These days this kind of stuff is standard, but at the time, like no one was doing this. So we spent months trying to get this stuff work, and the problem was like it almost always worked, but it wasn't robust. So once every 30 minutes, like someone would like put his foot down slightly wrong, and then you'd see him kind of like shake for a couple seconds, and then he'd go like flying off across the map, ejected into space because some equation divided by 0 somewhere, and suddenly like everything blew up.
Were these the robots when you say the bipedal robots?
Yeah,
or were these just
it was you in your powered battle armor.
Okay.
And your squad mates and the enemies.
Okay. And I was gonna say, did it look really different, or was it more just like when it moved?
It looked nice and realistic in the way it moved when it worked well. And so eventually we decided after a long time that we just couldn't get this to work robustly enough for a shipping game, and we switched to a very simple model where basically everybody's in an invisible hamster ball, that's interacting with the environment, and then had to make work to then sort of do all the animation to pretend that the person actually is moving their legs around and putting their feet on the ground.
Could you, in the more physics-based variation, could you jump as high? Because when I was playing it, I remember a very kind of like bouncy robot kind of a thing where you could just like bound over hills and stuff.
Right, I think we did that intentionally. You had this sort of turbo thing, I think, that you could turn on, so you could do that. Like we turned that on. I think we may have even amped that up because it was fun to go, bounding around all over the place.
That's actually there may be no connection in terms of like actual staff and people going to work on it, but it's just interesting talking about physics and simulation as a kind of design focus or a kind of like a philosophical focus. What you were just saying reminded me of when Austin was in here talking about Trespasser and how like there was this...
Which Seamus, the physics guy, was actually the project director on.
Oh, well, there you go. So yeah, because that's... Yeah, I guess that's what I'm wondering is like, seems like there's a concern with the same set of issues, right? Like, we really want to do interesting physics simulation. We really want to do an interesting world simulation, and we keep trying to put that in games. So you get stuff like Terra Nova, and then you get stuff like Trespasser, which... I know in the case of Trespasser, a lot of people criticize it, but it does have really interesting simulation aspects to it. And it sounds like in that case, even though they did cut a bunch of stuff at the end and try to make it into more of a fun game, it sounds like in the case of Terra Nova, it sounds like maybe more of those decisions were made in terms of cutting the things perhaps to try to get it to like a fun state.
Yeah, I think we made probably we made a pretty wide turn near the end, like once we kind of like figured out what our goal really should be, and then we weren't shy about like making a 90-degree turn to do that.
Okay, that is really interesting. I know. Was that something that was that you said you left in '96?
Yes.
So was that your last thing, Terra Nova?
So Terra Nova came out in early '96, And then I was actually the project director for Thief for a few months.
Okay.
Before I got lured away by a couple of my former MIT classmates to work at Harmonix, which was at that point just another tiny startup with around 7 people. And I handed off Thief to the head of our audiovisual department, whose name was Gregor Piccolo, who then later came to Harmonix, is now our VP of product development. So,
just out of curiosity, since you were kind of working on Thief at the very, very, very beginning, I know that project went through a lot of changes. What do you remember, what it was at the begining? Or
at the very beginning, it was a game called Dark Camelot, which was a Arthurian game where that was supposed to be grim and I think I'm trying to remember the enemy, the villains like Mordred and stuff had more complex motivations. Maybe you even played one of them. I don't know.
I seem to remember, I've heard it described as the Arthurian legend from the perspective of Mordred.
Okay, that makes sense. You could probably
it's kind of it's my dad's a jerk,
right.
which makes a lot of sense.
And then I don't remember whether it was just we thought that wouldn't fly as a mass market thing, but it got turned into this. So at that point, it was the main idea of it was about simulating swordplay. It was a big thing.
So another kind of simulation idea, let's take this one thing that's never been done before at this level of simulation fidelity and try to do it.
Right.
And it sounds like that's kind of a reoccurring thing with a lot of the games. And you're saying in the case of Thief, it was swordplay.
Yeah, which then that kind of took a back seat, and I don't remember which came first. The idea, we were trying to think of different kind of settings, kind of genres that we could do this sort of gameplay in, and then we got to the you're a thief idea, which seemed pretty cool.
Is that while you were still there?
While I was still there, yes.
While you were still there, okay.
I thought you said, is that why you were still there? That convinced me to stay. And that then led to the sneaking kind of mechanics, which were not really a part of the original Dark Camelot concept.
Well, that's why it was the Dark Project, not Thief the Dark Project.
Right.
Originally. No, I remember hearing that sword fighting story from a lot of people. I think Ken Levine at one point mentioned that, where he was kind of we were just trying to do stuff with swords, and the swords didn't really work, so we tried to think of a game where we had a reason to why you were a bad sword fighter. Because it sort of simulated being a bad sword fighter really well. And I remember, even though it's kind of sluggish and weird, I really liked the sword play in that game. And I think in later games, they took Garrett's weapon and made it into a dagger, which I guess makes a little bit more sense. But I always thought it was kind of funny in the original Thief. It was he's a thief, but he walks around with this giant sword, that
hopefully no one will notice.
That nobody would notice him with his giant sword. So that's okay. So one of the things that I'm interested in hearing from people on this podcast is how the kinds of concerns, or I don't know, design aesthetics, whatever you want to call it, that you had at Looking Glass informed the stuff that sort of maybe you did afterwards, or just if there's any kind of continuity of experience with, because I know that obviously being a music guy, doing some music at Looking Glass and then going to Harmonix, and I'm wondering if there's anything you want to say about that, or if anything about that strikes you as being a continuity.
The stuff that I've done at Harmonix has generally been extremely different from what I did at Looking Glass, and which it's funny, talking about some of this stuff here, reminds me why I'm so glad not to be doing it anymore. Things things we were talking about, the simulation aspect, and the stories and the plots. That's stuff that with games like Guitar Hero and Rock Band are totally absent almost. It's a very constrained environment where the player can do very discrete things, and any sort of extra plot is just sort of implied. We don't have branching plots or physics or anything
career
like this.
mode, which is a little narrative, but it's not.
But it's
really.
It's sort of narrative more through. It's like a board game kind of narrative, right? Oh, okay, now I got this card, and now I got more money. So in some way, the design experience I had at Looking Glass kind of informed my design at Harmonix in a negative way of like, here, I know that these kinds of things are really hard. Let's not try to do them at all, instead of trying to do them right or trying to do them a little bit. Let's see if let's try to do games that just like
that don't do them.
Just ignore that entirely,
Yeah,
because that's easier than trying to do it a little.
Yeah.
Right?
No, that's actually really interesting, because if it's funny that you say that, because it makes a lot of sense. It sounds like in the case of maybe Underworld and also Terra Nova, it seems like you kind of understood and respected the whole kind of like, let's do an interesting simulation goal, but that was never your thing that you were saying, I really want to do this. It was more like something somebody else wanted to do, and you worked there, so you were trying to work the problem.
Yeah, although in Underworld, I was really psyched about the simulation when we started out. We had Doug and Terry and I like had this dream back in college about writing like this big RPG that was just entirely simulated, and all the AIs were like, everything with all the characters were total AIs that had their own motivations and everything. And so we were really into the idea of doing a completely simulated like physicsy world. And then when I was trying to actually do game design and programming design on top of that, it becomes clear just how hard that is to do.
It's funny because when you talk about stuff like that, I mean, I think that even though it's probably not even close to what you were imagining at college, I mean, obviously like the Elder Scrolls series, at least in the popular imagination, has been trying to carry that torch. And one of the things that I always, and I like that series okay, but one of the things I always liked about the Looking Glass games is how by focusing on such a controlled situation, you were able to get a lot, in my opinion, a lot more nuance out of some of the simulation aspects of it. And I'm wondering if, was that something that, is that how you saw Underworld, as being like the fact, it's funny because it's called Ultima Underworld. It's like Ultima Underground, right? So it's kind of this very controlled, very constrained environment. And did that work for you in terms of getting you something that you were excited about? Like when it was over, you were like, ooh, that was sort of close to what we wanted to make in college, or was it not really close at all?
I think Underworld was pretty much the game that we wanted to make. I think we were all frustrated at the end, like we basically had to like get it at the door and finish it instead of spending another year like making it perfect, because we didn't understand what it was like to be professional game developers, right? We wanted to just work on it for as long as we wanted. But I think it pretty much ended up being the game that we wanted to make.
In terms of simulation, was it like when you were saying like we want to do stuff with simulation, we want to combine RPG elements with simulation elements in a way that results in something that's maybe a little bit more deeper, nuanced, or emergent than you would normally get in like a narrative-driven RPG? And did you feel, was it satisfying in that way?
Yeah, I would say it definitely was. We were happy in the way that things worked out, and the sort of stories like. You could tell it was a good game because people would tell stories about their experiences with it, right? They'd say like, oh, I was like, I had just killed this guy and then I was walking down the corridor and then these skeletons jumped me and I was at low hit points, so I had to run away. So I ran over here and then I hid in a room. And that, like if people are excited enough about what happened that they turn it into a story in their minds, and that means it was a success.
Well, yeah, and that's something that I remember having a very strong experience with the game in that way. I remember getting chased off a cliff and landing in the water, and only then realizing that there were octopi in there.
Right, and then you get like carried down the water, and you end up in some strange place you haven't seen before, and you have to find your way back.
Yeah. It was the thing I always like to talk about with Underworld is that even though you talk about the unstructuredness or incoherence of the story as being like a problem, and in some ways it allowed room for that kind of storytelling, right? I mean, because it was really. For me, I don't even remember the story of that game because it was just almost like Tom Sawyer, right? It was just like, really the game could have been called, oh my God, I'm trapped in a cave, right? And even though it took place in a fantasy world, it had that kind of elemental gravity to it, just kind of like, oh my, like what would you do in that situation?
And I think also the fact that it was the first of its kind helped a lot there, because you, as the player, having this sort of experience for the first time, I think there was sort of a sense of wonder that you got just from being able to explore this environment at all that you wouldn't necessarily get these days when you're playing, hey, it's another 3D RPG.
Yet another 3D RPG. And I know some people have been such huge fans of Underworld. There was that, what is it, Arcane Studios? They made this game, Arx Fatalis. Have you ever played that?
No, I remember like reading about it.
Do you remember hearing about it? It's definitely very much a kind of Underworld attempt to kind of, we want Underworld and we can't get enough of it. So it's very much kind of trying to recapture that kind of a thing.
You were asking about like sort of design things that carried forward from Looking Glass to art to my current games, and there was not so much actually in the games themselves, but in the sort of theory of gaming that we were all talking about at the time. There was this concept, and I think Doug actually got it from someone else, and I don't remember who it was. He called it the delicious interaction, and basically the idea is that your game should performing the main action of your game should just by itself be really satisfying. And the game that we were playing at that time that really had this was like NHL 91 or something for like the Sega.
This is during Underworld?
Well, we were doing Underworld, yeah.
Okay.
And just like checking someone into the boards was like so awesome. Like you just wanted to do it again and again. And it's not that. So that was a kind of thing we talked about. I don't think we actually implemented it so much because of it was the sorts of games that we had were a little more like abstract in that kind of way. But like, for example, like I think like using your bow in Thief is kind of like that. It's like really cool to like to focus in on something and then like go,
that moment,
and then it goes so.
Really different than the bow in Underworld games. I remember being really disappointed. I mean, I love the game, but I remember being really disappointed that I couldn't see my bow. And I remember playing Thief going weird. Like, oh, this is what I always wanted in the Underworld games.
Just that sort of design principle has informed, I think, things like Rock Band and Guitar Hero a lot, where the goal really is to make that tiny low-level interaction with the game just fun. You know, you press your fret and you strum the bar, and right when this gem is hitting the front of the screen and you hear this great sound, and you're like, I want to do that again and again.
So the idea that, I've heard that described in terms of, the kind of like the second-to-second gameplay, right? Like the one thing that you're, like if you just like forget about everything else, the whole meta system, everything else, you know, just like the thing that you're always doing has to be.
And I think it's more also kind of a physical thing of like the sort of connection from your fingers to the controller to the visuals to your ear, just like that feeling like it's a single like awesome interaction.
That it's all those things. There's no. It's like all those things functioning in sync. And
and you're controlling it. You made it happen. You want to make it happen again. 5 seconds later.
I think that's pretty good. I actually just wanted to ask you about Antigrav. Did you work on that? Or?
Yeah, Antigrav was the sort of the one harmonics project that went back to sort of the simulation-y kind of thing.
That's kind of why, because it's the only like non-music game, right?
Yes. What happened was that we had done Frequency and Amplitude, which were these music games for Sony for the PS2 that got good reviews but sold modestly. They weren't not terrible, but weren't big hits. And so we wanted to do another music game, and Sony said, "Oh no, we gave you 2 shots. That's enough. But we have this new controller. Maybe you can do something with it because we know that you do." Like,
and that was the iToy.
iToy, which was this sort of webcam thing for the PS2. So that sort of brought me back to all of this. Like I was doing the early image recognition for that, so like trying to figure out from the camera data, what you were doing. Are you, leaning, or where are your hands and stuff like that, which was kind of a fun research project, but turning that into a game that's going to work in everybody's home. In all these different lighting environments, it's the kind of thing that if it works 95% of the time, that's really cool for like a research project, but it's sucky for a game. So there were a lot of issues like getting that done. And in fact, there was a similar kind of a path taken from what I was to what I was describing with Terra Nova, where it started out being more simulation-y, and we had you going around on your hoverboard through environments like city blocks and stuff like that. And
more open world?
It was a more open world, but also more constrained. Constrained, not in that there's a track, but that there are lots of obstacles, right? You know, you're in the city, there are all these buildings and things like that, and trying to use your body to steer yourself through all of this was really hard. And you hit something, it was hard to back up just because of the ways there's no backup button, right? So it ended up being pretty frustrating. And what we decided halfway through the project was that we were going to dump all of that. We redesigned all our levels and we turned it into a much more streamlined thing where you're sort of more a marble going down a chute, and you can choose what you can sort of go from side to side down that chute and have some choices there. But it was much more about we're taking you on a journey automatically from point A to point B, and you can do things on the way. And we made it more gamey rather than exploration sort of based in that way. So it was pretty kind of parallel development where you tried the simulation first and decided it wasn't enough of a game.
Yeah. Were you happy to go back to music games after that?
Yes, I was.
Guitar Hero was next, right?
Guitar Hero was next. What happened was we were working on Anti-Grav while in parallel with the Karaoke Revolution games that we did.
Yeah.
And Guitar Hero was this tiny little project done with like 3 programmers, while most of the company was doing the 4th game in the Karaoke Revolution series.
Karaoke Revolution Party.
Yes,
I think
that's correct.
Yeah.
And then you know the rest of the story.
We know.
But that was a really fun project to work on. It was very constrained, in its design, and it was fun to just try to take this small target and totally nail it.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. Thanks for talking.